Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Illfoominati. I am your host, Ryan Fu. This is the We Are Denver Network. We are here giving you a little bit of insight in what's happening in our city and our state. I'm here with Pat Mellen. How you doing?
I'm well, thanks. How
Good.
are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. So we're going to be talking about Rocky Flats.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's something I hear you've got a little bit of expertise on.
A little bit, sure.
And why is that? Where did you start in the project and how'd you get there?
Well, about 2002, I started working in the national security clearance industry doing background investigations for clearances for people in positions that require access to tools and weapons and things like that. I did a fair amount of work in the Department of Energy sector for that, both at Lawrence Livermore and at Los Alamos. And
Gotcha.
when I moved to Denver, I became familiar with Rocky Flats simply by driving by it on Indiana, and noticed a real dichotomy between protesters who were saying, don't move here, there's plutonium, don't build a freeway here.
Right.
And people across the street from them with those signs waving back and forth, buy a house here.
Well, if you don't know, Rocky Flats is not very far away from our home here in Denver. It's in between, you'd say maybe Denver and Boulder.
It is. It's basically the territories between 93 and Indiana. At Route 128 on the north end, and Candelas is now a housing development just north of 72nd, but that sort of takes up the space between 72nd and the south border of Rocky Flats.
Gotcha. Well, we're going to be talking about all kinds of things and sort of get a short history of Rocky Flats, if that's all right, and then why it's important today. But I'm going to introduce my co-host, Samson, who's always here with us. How you doing, Samson?
I'm good. Good to see you.
Yeah, always good to see you. Samson brought us some fancy lights and some other new tables, so we're happy to be moving up in the world at We Are Denver. And if you are chilling for a little while, then watch Samson's podcast, which is right after this, Nothing Explained. Do you have a title or a concept for Nothing Explained this week?
No, we're winging it.
Nice. You're literally explaining
all
nothing.
of my energy went into fancy lights and tables and things.
You did a great job.
Yeah.
Well, that's all right, because we get to just relax for the next hour and talk to Pat about some of the more interesting and potentially scary things about Denver, Colorado, and Rocky Flats. So where did your work start intersecting with Rocky Flats itself?
All right. So I have been one of the attorneys working with Randall Weiner at the law offices of Randall Weiner in Boulder, Colorado, who filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of 5 local community groups to require that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service comply with both their own empowering statutes and other federal laws before they opened the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge to the public.
So for people who don't know, what is Rocky Flats?
Rocky Flats.
It's a good place to start.
Perfect. Rocky Flats has existed since the mid-last century. It was created by the Department of Energy to as part of the processing of plutonium for nuclear weapons.
So weapons-grade plutonium.
Correct. They created what are called pits. They're, I believe, about the size of a large, small paper plate, that were the triggers for the nuclear weapons that were then they left Rocky Flats as triggers, as component parts, and then were assembled into nuclear weapons at another location.
I'm sure they're still plenty dangerous when they're just the triggers or whatever it is, though.
Absolutely. Plutonium is a very dangerous substance. One molecule can, in fact, cause cancer. And once you ingest it, so there were a great deal of precautions that were both intended to be taken and taken at the site. But the question became that there was some unfortunate mishandling of the toxic substances out there that led to the shutdown of the plant in 1989.
So I know there was a fire that happened, right?
There were several fires. There was improper handling of waste products, a variety of things. After several-year investigation by John Lipsky, who was the lead FBI agent, and several of his colleagues, they executed a search warrant on June 6th of 1989, and the plant was in fact shut down.
So they
and
raided
never
it?
reopened. Yes.
Okay.
It's the first example of a federal agency actually raiding a sister federal agency.
So that's probably not a good sign.
That was exactly where I wanted to go with the question there. That sounds like unprecedented, but I'm glad you answered it without me asking. So.
Yeah, it was a first time event and led to a grand jury investigation that also became controversial. There were indictments recommended out of that grand jury that were not issued.
That is precedent, that in these kinds of, in the wake of the kind of reckless sort of silly precautions that aren't taken, or sometimes just what's the word for it, the legal word for not doing what you were supposed to have done?
Well, there's several different levels, but I think what you're talking about is negligence.
Negligence, that's the one.
Okay.
Yeah, but often
it's a standard of care, but there's
Standard
several
of care.
yeah, there's several different levels for that.
Well, it seems relatively common that when there's like significant negligence or reckless negligence, that folks don't get held accountable, not individuals. Were
Well,
there people held accountable in this case?
In this case, no. That was one of the aspects. A good book to go read if you'd like to know what more detail about that is called The Ambush Grand Jury.
Gotcha.
John Lipsky, Karen Balcony, and I'm going to blank on a name and I'll think of it later. The head of head of that grand jury wrote a book called The Ambush Grand Jury that covers what happened to the degree that they're allowed to disclose, because grand jury proceedings are in fact secret.
Yeah.
To the degree they were able to disclose what happened during that whole process. There's a book, and it's, I believe, just now a Kindle version has been released, in fact, this week. So you can find it online.
It's interesting that grand juries can only suggest indictments.
Right. And I'm not as familiar with that as I probably should be, but...
Yeah, and when I think of kind of funny business and juries and grand juries, usually what's happening is the judge is instructing the jury to ignore a certain piece of evidence, which... because of arguments made back and forth. But I don't feel like I've heard too many situations where a grand jury made a recommendation and then no movement was made on the recommendation.
They ended up in a plea bargain with Rockwell and Dow, and they pled guilty to environmental crimes. And then
So it was Dow Energy that ran Rocky Flats, or had a hand in it?
The original, they were the original contractors to the Department of Energy who ran that site, and then Rockwell took over several years before the actual raid, but they were both held accountable because they both contributed to the situation.
Gotcha.
Was there, does the evidence seem to show that there was quite a bit of lax things going on before and they took over and made no improvements?
It's interesting you say that. The grand jury documents are actually still sealed. There have been attempts to obtain those, and there's still some optimism that at some point they'll be released. But the grand jury documents are sealed, and those who participated in that effort are required not to disclose what what was covered in those documents as well.
What's the underlying moral behind that? Because is it that it's like a national security issue to release that, or what's the consideration around those grand jury proceedings being classified?
And they're not classified. They're
Not
just
classified, secret.
sealed within that's actually a court function.
Gotcha.
That federal law requires that grand jury.
So that's for every grand jury case in the world?
I don't know if that's true. I can't say that.
Oh,
for
okay.
Sure. But in this case, they did seal the documents, and they are stored down at the federal courthouse, much to many people's consternation, because there is wide-ranging belief in the actual worker community and the activist community that there's material in those grand jury documents that would in fact prove the case that the site is not safe and that the cleanup was incomplete.
Gotcha.
So yeah, then my question is, what can we say with confidence from the legal opinion as to what happened, what kind of situation is at Rocky Flats, and then what do we think is probably safe to assume is the case but cannot prove because of documents that are MIA?
Well, that in fact is the actual rub here, because the government, the federal government and local state officials took a position on the cleanup. They've entered into an interagency agreements between the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Energy all worked together to certify the cleanup was complete.
Gotcha.
And that's the debate, is that because those entities are all, well, the state of Colorado and the EPA are perceived to be the watchdogs and the champions of that process, there's a great deal of store put into the fact that they've pronounced the site safe.
So how much, as a Colorado citizen or as somebody who lives here or might live near in like Upper Westminster or in the areas closer to Rocky Flats, how much vest can we have in that? How much can we believe them?
And that's the other question, is like, because there has been so much time pass, and because the debate sort of ranges on about the science, it's a complicated issue, and many people believe, and understandably so, based on their investment in the area, based on their belief in trusting the government, that the site is safe and that the government certainly wouldn't allow people access to it if it were not.
What's your personal belief?
My personal belief is that a lot more science needs to happen, and a lot more disclosure needs to happen from people who know about actual activities on the site. One thing to bear in mind is that the site originally was that entire piece of property we just talked about.
Right.
So from 128 down to the border with Candelas, from Indiana to 93. In 2006, when the cleanup was declared complete, they split that property into what's called the Central Operable Unit, or the COU, which remains a Superfund site, overseen by the Department of Energy Legacy Management, and the outer portion, which is now the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge. Those lines were drawn. The line was drawn around the interior based on testing that was done and published, volume and volume and volume of. It's all available on the Department of Energy Legacy Management website. But literally thousands of pages of documents and testing, and they drew a line basically around the Central Operable Unit, believing that they had in fact contained the worst of the toxins that were left in place. I mean, there's literally plutonium still buried underground, 6 feet underground out there.
Well, that's part of the issue here in America, is we've got nowhere to put it.
Right.
I mean, where would we move it if we were to move it?
There are other waste facilities. The WIP facility in New Mexico is, I believe, reoperational. But that is the question. No one argues that that we have a problem in the United States for disposal of these wastes, and there are other sites, such as Hanford in the Northwest and Savannah River.
There are dozens of sites where there are these waste buildups, and they literally can't do anything but keep them there and try and solidify that area and say, hopefully nothing happens.
Well, and that becomes the question: what's a valid burial in place strategy?
Yeah.
So let's put it this way, my argument for the last 6 months has been, if I brought you that coffee cup full of plutonium and I said, hey, look, I'm going to bury that 8 feet below your garden, it's probably going to be fine. It's probably never going to come to the surface. What's a valid containment strategy if you have to leave it in place?
Yeah. So what do they do? I know they probably like bury it in concrete and they put it in do they not even do that?
No, basically.
That's not good.
Yeah, there were three levels of cleanup there, and I apologize, I'm not going to get the science perfect on this.
It's okay.
Yeah.
But there was basically, they cleaned to a certain level for the first several inches, and then another level to the 6 foot level, and then nothing below there. So
that's not good.
And they openly admit that in the documents that they have online. The problem is you have to go online and dig through thousands of pages of documents.
So you're saying part of the not to use the word propaganda, but part of the strategy might be that the average public is not going to spend the time going through those documents.
Correct.
Or informing themselves.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. And that's a serious risk.
Exactly. And so if you have a building that goes several stories underground, or if you have tunnels that semis drove through to transport the plutonium from the east gate to the processing plants, they admit that they left that contamination buried in place. with some remedial. My understanding is that they sprayed over it with some containment paint. But if you watch the news earlier this spring, there was an incident in Hanford where a earth-moving equipment fell through the tunnel because of because it's so heavy. And so that opened up the tunnel to then now open air.
Well, they were also constructed so long ago.
Right.
When was Rocky Flats built?
Over a period of many years, starting in the early 50s. So,
That's eventually that's going to give out. It almost doesn't matter what you make it of. If it's 100 and eventually 150, 200 years old, something's going to happen.
right, and the half-life of plutonium is 24,000 years.
Yeah, so there's no containment vessel that's been invented yet that will last to the half-life of plutonium, has there? Not that I'm aware of.
Not to my aware.
Yeah.
No.
So it's an issue whether or not we have it solved now or not.
Correct.
Yeah.
But you asked the question, where do we take it? And no one's necessarily advocating taking it anywhere. And honestly, dealing with the central operable unit is something that's not even on the table right now.
Really?
Well, because in August of 2017, the fourth 5-year review was done. Basically, when you have a CERCLA site, comprehensive, dealing with what's called residual waste. CERCLA is the federal government's regulation that handles waste that's already happened and needs to be cleaned up. And any time that a cleanup occurs under the Superfund where hazardous materials are left in place, every 5 years the remedy that has been blessed by the parties has to be audited. And the pertinent language remains protective of human health. So every 5 years, and the last 5-year update was issued in August of this year. Now, what's not commonly known is that for federal agencies, so there's two types of CERCLA cleanups. You've got cleanups that are done by private individuals. Let's say if you've seen the movie A Civil Action, where there was a tannery and they, disposed of things improperly, chemicals improperly, and they were held accountable for the CERCLA site and had to then, if anything was left, they would be responsible for. The EPA would then be responsible then for doing the 5-year updates. Mm-hmm. For a federal agency, the Department of Energy audits its own remedy.
Wonderful.
And so it's those sort of underlying principles that raise all kinds of red flags about the independence of the opinions, the whether anyone's actually overseeing any of this. Mm-hmm. The other issue is that the Department of Energy also pays for the oversight by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. So there's a lot of opportunities for conflict of interest. Yeah. That may have seemed like a good idea at the time and expeditious at the time. I've heard an argument that the reason why the Colorado Department of Energy the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment folks that do this should be paid for by the Department of Energy is that the citizens of Colorado shouldn't have to foot the bill for that. And that makes perfect sense. However, it also gives away the independence and the outside.
Well, I think it totally oversees the fact that there's $1 billion industry that makes plenty of money that made plenty of money on the production of this stuff and cleaning up, maintaining poorly several of these facilities. How come they're not footing the bill for all this stuff?
Well, and again, what the industries, Dow and Rockwell were the main operators of the plant when it was operational. And they had contracts with the federal government regarding how their processes were intended to work. They actually, there's actually a lawsuit filed by Rockwell against the Department of Energy saying that the procedures and the processes that they were expected to use to meet their contract would put them in violation of environmental laws.
That's not very good.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of finger pointing going back and forth about all of this.
Because, of course, there is. That's part of how the legal system works in those facilities.
Exactly. And there are a lot of environmental examples of we love the product of the process that is used to actually cause the harm, but we don't plan adequately for the cost of the cleanup when we're done.
So let's scoot back a little bit because nuclear power is still widely in use in the United States of America. So that means more and more of this waste. Not all of it is weapons grade waste.
As I say, sort of a different problem.
But still waste, still the storage and containment of stuff that we don't have an answer for.
Right.
So this is a problem that is, and still there must be some places where we're creating nuclear, like weapons grade nuclear stuff, right? This is not over.
Well, and interesting you should say that. The latest I have heard on that is that Los Alamos National Laboratories down just north of Santa Fe, and I've worked there for a few tours of duty, is the next place on the list to go back into plutonium pit production. Obviously, if
they're going to restart production there?
They've talked about it, that they need a location to actually do the processing. Los Alamos is where the actual Manhattan projects started.
Do we really need more nukes?
That's a question for someone above my pay grade.
Gotcha,
exactly.
gotcha.
I mean, in my opinion, that's just the wheels are turning, and there are people who expect the wheels to keep turning
because it makes a lot of money. It's a high value material, and the stuff they make it out of, and the people that pay them for it is all very, very top dollar. I mean, these are multi-billion-dollar companies. These aren't mom and pop shops that are doing these kinds of things.
And I'm not too familiar with that, but it's logically unlikely.
Yeah.
But Los Alamos has had its own issues in the news lately about handling of plutonium. That is actually an even older facility. From the development of the first nuclear bombs that were dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima back during the war, the World War II. So there's no good, elegant solution to this. The concern I've mostly been dealing with is it appropriate for the wildlife refuge to open to the public?
Yeah, so let's fast forward till today. Okay. What are the main issues regarding what citizens should be concerned about right now today?
The question becomes, was the cleanup
done properly,
right. Done completely? And you asked earlier how I became involved in this. My single biggest issue is notice. If people are fully informed of what they're buying and fully informed about the history out there and choose to do that, that is certainly their choice. But my concern is that
people aren't aware of what's even going on.
Well, and my perception is that buying a home, typically for most Americans, I believe, is the single biggest financial investment they'll ever make over time. And so the amount of due diligence and the amount of risk assessment that goes into that transaction, especially in the Denver real estate market, I think is really a big problem. They'll tell you, I spoke with a realtor 2 weeks ago who said, homes get in that area of Denver, get listed on Tuesday or Wednesday. They take offers until Sunday, and then by Monday they're in contract.
Wow, that's fast.
How do you, not in that particular, I'm not saying that's true for every house. I'm not saying it's true for those developments. But I'm saying in Denver, the market can be that fast. How do you do enough due diligence in that market environment?
It's not possible.
Right. So you look, there are different sources of information available. I know Candelis offers on its website its interpretation of the safety of
Would you buy a home up there?
Absolutely not.
No. I mean,
No.
And then
I wouldn't walk my dog up there.
Let's talk about a little bit like where that's coming from for you. Make it real for the listening audience.
Okay.
The cleanup is expecting a certain sort of livability situation, and what is the contention? What is the evidence against the idea that it is clean?
Okay. The evidence against the idea that it's clean, 3 things. One is that the original cleanup that was projected was for decades of work and billions of dollars.
And it fell way short of both those markers.
Correct. Right? It got done in 10 years because someone decided that's all we had to spend. Not all we had to spend. Let me make sure that's the right language. It's all the time we had, and it's all the money we had.
And how much money was it that was spent?
I believe it was $7 billion.
$7 million?
Billion.
$7 billion. Okay,
Yeah,
I was
seven,
like,
No.
Okay,
$7 billion was spent when the original estimate was multiples of that number. And essentially, they decided on a level of cleanup and backed into it. They put a fence around it. And it's a fence. I've seen it. I've gone on a tour of the site, not the internal site, but the refuge itself. And it's a barbed wire fence, 2 pieces of barbed wire going around the outside. And so you've got the COU, so there's still and no one's hiding this, there's still toxic waste buried on that site. The outer perimeter refuge area saw no cleanup, and they will admit that. There was never a cleanup action taken on any of that space.
Wow.
So I don't know if you're familiar with the Cook v. Rockwell case that was settled here in over the last couple of years. And I say over because there's always a lot of, mop up legal work that happens when you have a class action in terms of who's going to receive payouts. And so it's been going on for about a year and 3 or 4 months. $375 million after 20 plus years of litigation. If you look at the map of the real estate where the Cook class is, and they have their own website for their the Cook class action. There's a third party that's actually administering the payouts for that. If you look at the map, and you'll see that the space or the real estate area includes part of the refuge, and the jury from the Cook v. Rockwell case found that there was plutonium contamination on that plume. So there's a line. Well, part of that line includes the refuge, the eastern portion of the refuge. And so there are inconsistent logic arguments that say in this case, the jury found that there was contamination and it would be permanent. And there wasn't a way to remediate it because if you think about the fires you mentioned earlier, how do you clean plutonium out of a tree? How do you clean plutonium off a roof? How do you take it out of a, wet cement?
You spray it with containment paint.
Well, but how do people then live there?
Yeah, you can't.
So there was an estimate of the amount of damage, and based on factors that I'm not privy to, they're going to try to divvy up that $375 million among the people who were damaged, who lived there. And the class is limited to people who were living at the site at the time of the raid, which was June 6th, 1989. So one of the challenges has been finding all of those people and advising them of the situation and determining if they want to participate.
Man, that's crazy to me. We were talking last week a little bit about the Bhopal India disaster and how even after, 20 years of legal battle, or 10 years or something, it was a long time of the legal battle, that when they finally started paying people out, it was like millions of dollars of payout over a certain amount of time to certain people per month ended up being like $20 to each individual.
It's a lot less. Yeah, it's a lot less based on the number of people.
Yeah.
I've heard anywhere between, there's a lot of numbers running around, but we're talking in the neighborhood of 10,000 people, 10,000 different people who might divvy up that $375 million. So it's not as much as it sounds like. But you asked about the cleanup. The issue is this: if they're paying people based on a finding by a jury that there's contamination and it's permanent and it was the fault of Dow and Rockwell,
then it's still contaminated.
Right. Well, and what's contaminated, it wasn't like the plutonium magically jumped over the refuge and onto these people's property.
Right.
It spread across that entire space. So the logic is that the contamination also fell on the refuge area.
So what's the wildlife refuge and what are they planning to do with it and why is it opening?
Well, back in 2001, Congress passed the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge Act, creating the refuge and deeding that property to the Fish and Wildlife Service for its stewardship as soon as the cleanup was considered complete.
And that was in 2006.
That was right. It was 2006 is when the cleanup was considered complete. I believe the actual transfer of the land didn't happen until 2007, but we're mincing words. What the Fish and Wildlife Service did back in 2005 was publish what's called a comprehensive conservation plan and an environmental impact statement of what was going to happen to that property. And there was a robust process that included sampling, it included public participation in 2005. And it basically evaluated 4 options related to what would happen at the site between keeping it closed, keeping it open on a very limited basis, and they ended up arriving at a plan that allowed limited use. There was what's called a visitor contact station, a small 750 to 1,000 square foot kiosk looking building where it would be what's called seasonally staffed. So on weekends and high traffic periods, there would be
I wouldn't
somebody
want to work there.
Yeah. And so there would be trails and there would be some limited hunting and limited, activities up there.
Mm-hmm.
The concern is that that evaluation was done in 2005. It's 12 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
In the environmental world, we would argue, or at least our side would argue, that evaluation is stale.
Yeah.
So there's a concept called staleness, which means that the conditions
could have totally
changed by now.
Yeah.
So an environmental impact statement is what's issued. It's the second level of detail of scientific study and impacts on the environment of the plans that the federal government is considering. It can be invalidated by either a significant change in circumstances or a significant change in plan.
Mm-hmm.
And that requires the National Environmental Protection Act NEPA requires you to do what's called a supplemental EIS or environmental impact statement if either of those two conditions exist. So a significant change in circumstances.
That's one.
We look at things like the massive flood that happened in 2013 in that area of Denver and what it might have brought to the surface. And when the monitoring stations that were out there were overwhelmed and unable to actually take the readings that they're intended to take. We look at a significant change in project. And that's really where my focus is on the fact that the alternative that was agreed to was called Alternative B. And all of these documents, again, are available online. Alternative B included, again, this small 750 to 1,000 foot visitor contact station. What happened in 2015 is that the Department of Energy and the Fish and Wildlife Service entered into what's called a memorandum of understanding, also supportive, which is a sort of an agreement. You and I are going to agree to do something some way. Then backed up with what's called an interagency agreement, which means I can pay you money to do that, to build a 3,000 square foot visitor center, multi-purpose visitor center. So 3 to 4 times the original size that was agreed to. New trails that were not agreed to. The Rocky Mountain Greenway.
So people can go and visit. This is a place you could hike.
Right. Well, and hike. The intent, and again, remember there's a difference between a national park and a national wildlife refuge.
Right.
And so a wildlife refuge is intended, it's got the word wildlife in it for a reason. It's intended for wildlife-related activities. And so about April of 2016, an announcement was made that took a lot of people sort of by surprise. I'm not sure if you're familiar with America's Great Outdoors Initiative by President Obama. And Ken Salazar, who was in Congress at the time, and they entered into an agreement creating what's called the Rocky Mountain Greenway. And that is a trail that is intended to run from the Arsenal out near the airport. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that location. All the way across Denver through Three Ponds Park, which I actually don't even know where it is, but I believe it's somewhere in Arvada. And then out past Rocky Flats up to Rocky Mountain National Park. Until 2016, the maps for that had that greenway going around the outside, the perimeter of Rocky Flats, where there is already open space, both with the City of Westminster, City and County of Broomfield, Town of Superior, Boulder County. There's tons of open space out there. In April of 2016, it was announced that the Greenway would actually go through Rocky Flats Wildlife Refuge. And the public was not involved in that decision. It was created out of the Greenway Commission feasibility study. And so the concern is this. On the website, if you look today at the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge website, it says they're opening next summer. And when we filed the lawsuit in May of this year, the all of the information we had available to us at the time said that the groundbreaking would begin in June of this year. And if you do the math on how long it takes to build a 3,000 square foot building, if you're going to open in the spring, there's a lot that still has to be done. Building of roads, building of parking lots, building of this facility. So the question is, when does a shovel go in the ground? And is that when the deadline is to do this environmental impact or updated supplemental study? And what's the public process that should be in place that the public has a right to say, hey, wait a second, we didn't sign up for a 3,000 square foot building. What else could the $8 million that the Department of Energy is
be used for?
Yeah, be used for in the area. Is that the best use for it?
Yeah.
Is anyone going to visit and use it?
Well, yeah, is your money better spent making it like nice and habitable for humans, or would it be better making a really nice fence?
Right.
Is the long term, if you're not going to clean it up, or if nothing else is going to happen there, is your best option really letting people in when you could be spending that money on keeping people out?
Well, and that's the policy question. If you speak and I've listened to a lot of presentations, and I've spoken to David Lucas, and he genuinely believes this is his mission and mandate, that based on the Rocky Flats Act back in 2001, the Fish and Wildlife Service has a mandate to open the refuge.
Interesting.
And now they have the money to do it, courtesy of the Department of Energy. But realize that process of turning former nuclear weapons facilities or former military facilities into wildlife refuges is something that happens across the country.
Right, yeah, I do know that.
Well, what can we say about the potential for, like opening the wildlife refuge, kind of like in the same way of like putting a nice thin layer of dirt over the contaminated area, very literally. In a legal sense, how much does the opening of this kind of give you a legal cover? Like that stops all your lawsuits. Like, well, we opened the place, it must be fine. And
Well, and so you hit on an interesting point. One of the difficulties in this entire process is engaging the public. Lawyers will talk to you all day about causation, which is one of the hardest things to prove. So you won't get sick right away. If you go out to a site, any site, and you ingest or inhale hazardous particles, it will take a great deal of time for that to actually manifest itself. And we're seeing the effects on workers now. And one of the groups, the Rocky Flats Downwinders, is one of the groups, and they're also on the web, and they're looking for people to participate in their medical studies, is that it takes a really long time for the effects of the exposure to manifest themselves, and to manifest themselves in a way that is basically statistically significant. So there's been a lot of back and forth on the medical issues, on the cancers, clusters that have been found, on the epilepsy, recent discovery of an epilepsy cluster in Arvada near the site. So again, the best example I can give you is back to the movie Civil Action. How do you prove that illness is directly related to exposure on the refuge?
Well, and you add that into how long it takes for any of class action suit to get all of those studies funded, then to go to the legal processes of getting them someone to take blame for that, for the court to finally give its ruling, and then finally for there to be a payout for all of those things. That could be a 30 or 40-year stretch.
The Rockwell case is a good example.
At that point, the people who've made their billions of dollars are on their way, and there's no incentive for anyone who's making money, potentially polluting the environment, and potentially hurting people to not do it if the system will just sort of take this long because they know they can get away with it and move on with their life.
Well, I call that the collateral damage of the free market system. And that's true in every industry, more so in this one because of the sovereign immunity of the federal government. But the free market society we live in allows a great deal of collateral damage.
Yeah, an incredible amount. And
some of that collateral damage is injured, ill, or in fact dead people that matter to us. But the ability for for the public to use that information to bring about change takes the public being engaged and aware of what they're exposing themselves to.
So let's step back then from all the specific issues regarding Rocky Flats and talk more about what is going on and how could we change that sort of system? Because whether it's Rocky Flats or it's issues like Bhopal or the various institutions across America that tend to also sort of environmentally discriminate against people who don't have the means to fight back, what do we do to start getting a little bit of traction to change this?
Well, most people would tell you that that's a legislative issue, that changing our laws to hold ourselves or companies accountable. And that's the difficulty. Who are we sending to Congress? Who are we sending to our state legislatures? You'd see there's a great difference between how the state of Idaho and how the state of Washington and the state of Colorado what
deal
standard,
with all this kind of
exactly,
stuff.
Exactly. So I grew up in the Midwest, and I was unaware at the time at the great differences in the state government expectations and what that meant, and it never really factored into where I decided to live.
Well, isn't that part of the point
now.
of the EPA, though? Is that the idea is at least that there would be a federal agency that would oversee the different state standards and help sort of hold people accountable. Are they doing their job? Because it kind of seems like they're not.
Well, and I think there's been a lot in the press lately about whether the Environmental Protection Agency has the right mandate and whether they are enforcing the right mandate.
Right. The enforcing part is the part that I'm concerned about.
Well, and that's part of the issue is that the free market, I mean, ideally your idea happens is that we open a refuge and nobody goes. Maybe that's a strategy, that we do such a great job of educating people to stay off Rocky Flats or to keep Rocky Flats closed, that in fact you throw a party and nobody comes.
Right.
That seems like a lot of money spent inappropriately. I would also tell you that there will be collateral damage to the local communities when all that dust gets kicked up as you're digging foundations and
right,
roads.
in a place where there's plutonium only 6 feet under the ground.
Well, remember that
potentially.
And I want to be really clear. They're not talking about doing construction of the visitor center or those trails in the COU. That is a separate location. But
still, like you said, it's a wide berth of an area, and we're unclear as the public as to what is safe and what's not.
Well, and that's fueled by a lot of, like you said, sealed documents. The other issue is this. There is a great deal of undercurrent discussion about disposal of waste, burying of waste out on the refuge site that has never been addressed or dealt with. And coming up with the documents or the eyewitness testimony to prove that is the challenge.
Yeah.
And how do you prove what was actually taken off site and dumped in the back 40? And that's the concern, is that because sampling is an imperfect process, it is a statistical safety blanket for the government to say we've sampled and we've sampled and we've sampled, and there are no problems that would be beyond what's called background. And the concern is this: if you average anything, you can make it look fine. If you take a big enough sample and you average it, you're going to get a number that you like.
Yeah.
The issue is that masks hotspots that are known to exist. If you go look in the thousands of pages of data that are out on the regulatory website,
of course, there
are hotspots that exist on the refuge. And so the concern is not so much that they'll hit those 6 stories that are underground, but they'll put a backhoe into a drum that got disposed of, that isn't listed anywhere, that was never...
That's terrifying
dealt with.
To consider. That, and it's almost just an incredible amount of negligence that it could even happen.
Well, and the concern is, and so the focus has been, what's the science? What science do we need to ensure that site is safe and that we are making an accurate representation to the people who will visit it, that they are safe to go there? I would not take a dog out there to let him drink water out of a puddle, or I wouldn't take a child out there to play in the dirt. And that's really what we're talking about when you open a refuge, is that you can't control what's going to happen. Once you open it, you can anticipate and put, trail fences up and things like that, but you can't, unless you're going to put them in a monorail and drive people around it so they can't actually interact with the environment.
You have no idea how people are going to deal with it, or touch it,
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the concern is, I think, turns now, because as you've probably seen in the papers, the lawsuit that was filed in May was dismissed because the judge in our case doesn't believe that the plans haven't progressed far enough, or the actions haven't progressed far enough, that the Fish and Wildlife Service couldn't now do the environmental impact statement or do the supplemental that we've asked for. So our hope is
so they couldn't do the study because they're already too far along, or they're not yet far along?
Well, the judge believes that there is still time, that the plan
for them to do
the study, and that the plans that have been in place and the money that has been spent isn't enough to require that.
So just to clear that up, the motion or whatever was an injunction to stop it from moving forward because you're waiting for a survey, and the judge dismissed the case because he thinks that there's plenty of time to do the survey, so there's no reason to stop.
But is there any intention to do that survey?
Well, and it's actually a she, unfortunately, Judge Arguello. That's all right. That's the question. The filings all include many reassurances that if and when we decide there needs to be an environmental
evaluation here,
the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Okay.
If and when Fish and Wildlife Service decides that the circumstances exist that they need to do an environmental assessment, they'll do it. And so just trust us.
But there's no something's not going to happen that will force them to do that at some point in the future, or there is a 5-year review, but that's after it's built.
The 5-year review just happened, so
at this point, there's nothing that's going to legally force them to do it. So
Correct.
we just have to assume they're going to at some point.
Or we have to decide that when we see shovels going in the ground, that if there's not been a process happen, then...
So that's why that date is so important.
Right. Mm-hmm. The other thing to bear in mind is that there is no opportunity for outside organizations to actually visit the site to do anything. It's a closed site. It's a secure site.
We can't go there with Geiger counters and check it out for ourselves.
No, and that actually brings up a different interesting point. There's been a great deal of dispute about the concept of a Geiger counter. And lots of science that's been reported about the site is based on Geiger counter and gamma radiation when, gosh, I hope I get this right, it's about alpha radiation. That actually, to detect the presence of plutonium, you need special equipment, not just your average garden variety Geiger counter. Mm-hmm. And so, it takes a certain level of sophistication for the public to not be misled by what sounds like really good science when it's just really technical sounding science.
Right, when they're we brought up Geiger counters, nothing happened, but that's not going to be the right instrument to measure that. Right.
Correct.
It's the wrong spectrum.
Exactly.
So then let's get to how do we inform the public? Talking like this on a podcast is one way, and I hope people listen to this, and I know a lot of it's really technical, but this is important stuff, and this is happening in our community, and there are people that really care about it. So talk to us about who's doing what, how can you get involved, and then what would the potential action steps be?
Okay. There is a renewed interest that we hope is in some way engendered by the lawsuit that we have filed and the newscasts that are out there. Mm-hmm. Realize that there's 3 significant initiatives going on that we're concerned about. The first is the opening of the Refuge. And organizations that we represented in the lawsuit are the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center. They are a membership-based group. They're based in Boulder, and they are on the web and would greatly appreciate any participation, contribution. My understanding is they're often at the Boulder Farmers Market. Mm. Second is the Rocky Flats Right to Know. This is an organization based in Arvada. They also have a website. They have meetings, I believe, twice a month, where they present different speakers talking about this issue. The Environmental Information Network, EIN, those are, in fact, 2 sisters who have extensive personal experience with the site. They participated in the actual community groups who participated in trying to set the standards for what happened back during the cleanup. They also have a webpage. They are very much focused on providing scientific expertise and connecting people who've been affected by it. The Candelas Glows, Rocky Flats Glows. It's two sister organizations run by two women in the community. They also have websites that you can participate to learn more about the activities. And then the Rocky Flats neighborhood organization, and I believe he is actually also has a website out there. So those are the 5 organizations we worked with. The issues that are going on out there, the opening of the refuge, and any people who want to participate and understand what's going on there. I think the next steps, we have not really regrouped to decide what's going to happen in the wake of the lawsuit. It's a little fresh yet. But it does turn to how do we educate the public about the situation. Second is about the installation and creation of what's called the Jefferson Parkway. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Okay. So we'll talk about it for just a second. The JPPHA, the Jefferson Jefferson Public Private Highway Authority. The Jefferson Parkway is intended to complete the highway system on the perimeter of
the C470, E470.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And so there, you know that that's sort of the part from 9 o'clock to midnight doesn't exist, right?
Yeah, Broomfield Golden.
Exactly. And so part of the 2001 Rocky Flats Act deeded a 300-foot right-of-way along the eastern edge of the refuge to the transportation organization or transportation authority that would eventually create the parkway. And so that parkway is going forward. And there was a big meeting on Wednesday out at the new K-8 school out in Candelas talking about that. There's an entire organization, jppha.org, that is, pushing that initiative forward. And so any participation people want to learn about the construction, because literally they're going to build a freeway along, their intent is anyway, along a 300-foot right-of-way along the eastern edge of Rocky Flats through some of those hotspots. Then also is all of the development that's going on out there between Whisper Creek and Candelas and Layden Rock and the homes, because that site was picked back in the early 50s because it was basically no man's land. And without the expectation that there would be
homes and
$500,000 homes backing up to the site. And so, educating themselves about what's going on out there. Again, voting with your feet. If you don't buy a home out there, then that forces the powers, that organization to reevaluate its situation. That's what the free market works.
Right, and it has a combined effect. If people can be a little more aware of what's going on, people aren't going to buy homes out there, and that'll have hopefully a sort of cyclical effect on that being less powerful or being less impactful into people's lives.
Well, and the difficulty there is that someone's going to get hurt. Because either financially or physically, but financially, if you go look at the Love Canal case, I don't know if you're familiar at all with Love Canal. There was a Superfund site that the government basically evacuated everyone out of, paid them off to move, went back and did a remediation of that site, and then reopened it and resold the property. And so Love Canal 2, and it was recently in the news, is that the same illnesses that were discovered before the cleanup are happening again.
This is the same story that I hear over and over again when it comes to these kinds of cleanup efforts and just how our government and how the market and capital industry tends to deal with this stuff, which is A, they do a poor job, B, they package it up well and then resell it again, and then see this people get the same illnesses that they were getting in the first place. So there are various movements to learn about this in particular. If you're somebody that wants to stop this kind of stuff from happening in the future, though, what would you suggest that we do? I mean, we can write letters to our congressmen or try and elect the right people, but
that's part of it.
What else?
It's got to be a multifaceted effort. And I just had this conversation last week with a friend of mine in local government that it has to be coming from multiple directions. It has to be an economic effort that people, don't buy in those locations because they're hazardous.
Vote with your money.
Vote with your money. Vote for the people that you believe are going to protect you. or that are willing to listen to the individuals or the citizens versus lobbying money versus industry money. Get involved in efforts at the ground roots with the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center or the other organizations that we talked about who do try to raise awareness of the issue in the community. You know, it's not, there's no one easy answer. If there was, we wouldn't be talking about it 50 years later.
Right.
It's about being willing to spend the time to learn. And I think time has become sort of the single most valuable commodity in modern life. And that if I can, there's also a denial factor of it's not going to happen to me. That these bad effects that might happen, if they happen, they're going to happen to somebody else, or they're going to take so long to hurt me that I'm going to get hit by a car first. You know, that it's that sort of mentality. And unfortunately, that allows a lot of these bad acts to go, or I don't know if you say bad acts. It allows these...
Sort of irresponsible at the very least.
Well, they're at least controversial. And there becomes a point where people also get numb. That the one of the easy things to have happen is to be marginalized as the sort of the kooks or the crazies of the situation, and the protesters, they've been protesting forever.
Right.
And there's really nothing bad that's happened. And so there's this dulling effect that happens, that the scientists who have week after week after week, month after month, challenged the findings and what's being disclosed, who have been marginalized by the fact that, we can't get any new science.
Right.
That's part of the problem. Allow an outside, help us lobby to allow an outside independent scientific organization to go in and do a study. But I think part of the resistance comes from, we need to communicate better what would be acceptable. So if we don't like the level of science or the level of assurance that's gone on out there, what would be acceptable? Right. Can we tell them, if you do this, we'll agree with you, it's fine?
Well, it's hard. I mean, if you're just an average mom who's trying to buy a home somewhere, you know, science might not be your forte, and exactly what methodologies might be appropriate. So I think that it's a giant issue. So
Right.
I want to first off say thank you so much for coming and sitting
You're
down
welcome.
with us to discuss this.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, it's just an absolute pleasure. And hopefully, if you're a listener and you listen through this thing, I hope that you're considering that there are tons of these issues out there in the United States of America and all over the world. And there are people like Pat who are out there working, and Pat is a lawyer. I don't know if we ever actually mentioned that.
Right. Sorry. Yes, I have my own law firm, Pat Mellen Law.
Yeah.
And but I also work with Randall Weiner in the city of Boulder, and so you can contact me at either location.
And her website will be in the link, comment, information thing that you see underneath the YouTube video. But also know that this is a wider issue, and that there are plenty of people out there who don't have the resources to fight this kind of stuff, as blatant as it may be in their communities. So get to know the people in your communities and the folks like Pat who are doing the work in your communities to try and inform folks and learn a little bit about it. So hopefully you guys learned a little bit more. So I want to say thank you again so much for being with us, Pat.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for being with us, Samson.
Yeah, if I could maybe
anything else you've
interject. Well, my thoughts are that, really, unfortunately, it's a publicity battle.
It is.
And if things are looking inevitable, my thought is to maybe the publicity angle would be to some sort of you're not invited groundbreaking ceremony. And instead of sending people, you send in the robots.
Well, and that's interesting because there was an encirclement of Rocky Flats. If you go look in the archives of that, and we talked about that for the rally that happened yesterday, and we decided that it would be irresponsible for us to invite the public to come to the site because we believe the site's dangerous.
Right.
So that's what
you're
I'm
not
saying.
invited.
Maybe the publicity is hey, this is happening. You should definitely not come.
Right.
And in my mind, I see robots ribbon cutting ceremony. Robots, no humans anywhere nearby.
So that we could do it from a safe distance.
Yeah, because when it comes to something like Chernobyl, that fear is tapped into through the media of showing you that robot creeping down a weird hallway,
Right.
and then the robot dying from overexposure. And so send in, take that same thing where they're trying to make you afraid of that situation and use it against them as hey, you guys, this is amazing, don't go.
No,
Right.
it's such a strange world we live in that it is a publicity battle at this point. That if people don't know about it, then they're just going to be able to keep on doing whatever they want.
Well, and it begs the real question of, with so many beautiful venues in the state of Colorado,
Right.
why here?
Yeah, and tons of people are genuinely going to ask that. Like, I could go to Red Rocks. Why even matter about this one? But, I mean, if it's affecting human beings' lives, that's got to be something we start prioritizing over our own
Over the
wellness.
monetary and
Yeah, or even just comfort.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's the end of this podcast. I learned a whole lot, so thank you so much for being so informative. And I hope that you learned a little bit too, Samson. And I hope you learned a little bit too. This has been Illfoominati. I'm Ryan Fu. This is the We Are Denver podcast. Come check out our Halloween party on October 14th. It'll be nearly as spooky as this conversation.
Thank you.
All right. Love and peace, everyone. I hope you're well, and we'll see you around.
Big up to Rich in the Ghost House, where we do all of this recording.
Ghost House Studios.